Today, we're in the Panhandle and heading up to the rooftop of the Sunshine State.
Hi, I'm Scott Marthaler. Today, we're in Florida and headed up to the high point in the state. But before we start this adventure, let's take a moment, click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates.
Located in Walton County, about 1 mile south of Florida's northern border, Britton Hill looks more like something you'd find in the Midwest than what you'd expect from a state known for sun and sand. When you think of Florida and nature, you probably think of sandy beaches, and that's understandable. After all, it has over 1,300 miles of coastline, the second most in the country, and most in the lower 48 states. Or maybe you think of the Everglades, one of the great tropical wetlands in the world. Or maybe the Florida Keys, stretching from Miami into the Gulf of Mexico. What you probably don't think of is elevation. And for that, you could be forgiven. Based on a few studies, Florida is both the flattest and flattest looking state in the country.
But if you look a little bit closer, there is elevation to be found in this state. And how it came to be is probably a little more interesting than you ever thought. If you were to divide Florida up into two spots, relatively easy divisions, whether historically, geologically, geographically, or even culturally, then one of the most logical splits is here. The peninsula and the Panhandle.
Florida has a fascinating geological history. The peninsula isn't originally from here. It's an immigrant of sorts, originating in Gondwanaland, now the continents of Africa and South America. The peninsula formed on the northwestern coast of that landmass around 500 million years ago, and then separated from it 300 million years ago.
When Pangea formed, Florida was wedged between the North American and African plates. When that supercontinent eventually broke up, Florida remained behind with North America. Throughout most of its geological existence, Florida could probably best be described as a creature of the sea, submerged beneath the ocean, only rising above the waves when the water level dropped enough to expose the land.
With a history like that, you'd be right to assume the peninsula doesn't have much in the way of elevation. But there is an exception: the Central Highlands that run from Lake County in the north down to Lake Okeechobee. Known as the Lake Wales Ridge, it is actually an ancient sand dune with a noticeable rise in elevation compared to the surrounding landscape.
The highest point on the ridge is Sugarloaf Mountain at 312 feet. Imagine that, a mountain in Florida. But I shouldn't be so quick to discount it, because Sugarloaf Mountain has some pretty interesting traits about it. For starters, it's the highest point on the entire peninsula, a fairly significant chunk of land, and it's also the most prominent peak in the entire state, with enough prominence that it actually ranks higher than several other states. It's also the most isolated peak around, with no comparable elevation in 200 miles. If you do get a chance, it's worth checking it out because you will get some amazing views of the Central Florida region.
In the Panhandle, the geology is a bit different. Britton Hill is part of the Florida Ridge Hills, though you need to do a bit more digging if you want information on them. If you just take a cursory search, you'll find that this area of highlands is a small ridge of hills and plateaus made of rock and mud, and they run from the Florida Panhandle through southeast Alabama into the southwest corner of Georgia.
Once again, though, there is more to this place than what you might think at first glance, both geologically and historically. That earlier description of Britton Hill is correct. It really is more of a small plateau with dimensions of about 400 yards by 900 yards. It sits on the Citronelle Formation, one of the geological formations that make up the larger Gulf coastal plain.
This area was formed about 2.5 million years ago, around the end of the Pliocene epoch. If you wanted to describe this in a more poetic way, you could say Britton Hill was formed from the memories of mountains. The sand and gravel sediment that make up this area is from the Appalachian Mountains to the northeast. Over the millions of years, as the mountains were weathered down, that debris was carried by streams and rivers down to form the coastal plain.
There are several geological features that are unique to this area that are totally worth checking out if you have the time. The first is the coastal dune lakes. These bodies of water are rare around the world. In fact, you'll only find them in 4 countries. In the U.S., only the states of Florida, South Carolina, and Oregon have them.
Their definition, shallow bodies of water found in dune ecosystems within 2 miles of the coast, belies the complexity of these ecosystems. They are thought to have formed around 10,000 years ago by wind coming off the Gulf of Mexico. Rain, streams, and groundwater filled up the depressions behind the dunes. One of the coolest features of these lakes is when they get too big, or in times of high tides or excessive rainfall. They breach the sand berms and the fresh water empties into the Gulf. This is called outfall. This is also when the salt water enters the dune lake, creating a brackish water environment for a wide variety of plants and animals.
The largest of these lakes in Florida is Lake Powell. You can find a good place to take it in at Camp Helen State Park. This one behind me is Western Lake at Grayton Beach State Park. 2 other places that have easy access to these are Topsail Hill Preserve State Park and Deer Lake State Park. It's totally worth the time to come down here and check out a very cool and interesting ecosystem. But if you are pressed for time and you're looking for something closer to the high point, well, there is another interesting lake that can fit the bill.
About 23 miles south of Britton Hill is Defuniak Springs, the seat of Walton County. In the city's historic district is Lake Defuniak, one of the more unique bodies of water in the state.
This 40-acre, 1-mile circumference lake claims to be one of only 2 almost perfectly round, spring-fed lakes in the entire world. According to local legend, it was created by the impact of a meteorite, though, due to the geology of this area, a more likely culprit is that it's the remnant from a sinkhole. Humans have been living in Florida for millennia. There's archaeological evidence that Paleo-Americans first arrived in this area around 14,000 years ago, with some actually pushing the dates out even further to 20,000 years ago.
Starting around the year 800 of the current era, the dominant civilization, throughout the Midwest and southeastern United States was the Mississippian culture. Known for their mound building, urban settlements, and large-scale maize-based agriculture, this civilization, with its regional variants, would thrive for close to 800 years. In the southeastern U.S., the branch that existed was the South Appalachian Mississippian.
The tribe from that culture that lived in this area were the Pensacola. Their area of influence stretched from the bay that's named after them up into the Panhandle, though some of their territory overlapped with the Appalachian people to the east. In 1528, they would encounter Europeans, in particular the Spanish from Panfilo Narvaez's ill-fated expedition, as it traveled up and along the Gulf of Mexico.
The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century would have a devastating effect on many of the Florida peoples. Disease ravaged their populations, and by the 18th century, many of the tribes throughout Florida had vanished.
This area would be no different. When the Spanish returned and attempted to establish a colony here in the mid-16th century, they found the area practically deserted. Over the next few centuries, the remainders of the Pensacola would assimilate into other successor tribes, such as the Muskogee, the Choctaw, or the Seminole.
There is still a remnant of their time that can be found in this area, and is worth checking out: the Fort Walton Mound. This 1,200-year-old archaeological site in Fort Walton Beach is one of the 3 surviving mound complexes found in the Panhandle. When you look at a map of Florida and its neighboring states, a few questions may spring to mind. First off, why is there a Panhandle? Why does it seem that Georgia has a part of it? And why doesn't Alabama have the rest of it? And what does this all have to do with the Highpoint?
To answer those questions, and to figure out how the Sunshine State lost its elevation, well, we need to jump back in time, over half a millennia ago, to when Europeans first explored this area. When Ponce de Leon arrived on Easter Sunday in 1513, Florida became the first major land claim and attempted European settlement in North America for the Age of Discovery. And what a claim Spanish Florida was! The territory stretched all the way up into the Carolinas and then westward to the Mississippi and Louisiana.
For the next 250 years, Florida would be part of the Spanish Empire. But despite this massive chunk of land, the truth was much different. With the exception of a few expeditions, particularly Hernando de Soto and Juan Pardo, most of the interior of this territory remained relatively unexplored. The Spanish did establish missions, but most were on the coast.
Spain really had no interest in this territory, and for the most part considered Florida a colonial backwater. In the minds of the empire, the most useful purpose that this place served was as a buffer to protect its interests in the Caribbean and Mexico from English and French expansion in North America.
Spanish settlers here did have some success ranching cattle. In a unique bit of Florida history, it is from these cattle that the Florida Cracker cow is descended, now one of the oldest and rarest breeds of cattle in the United States.
Other types of agriculture would prove too difficult to develop, and the Native American population was too sparse to force into slavery. Not that the Spanish didn't try. Plus, there were no precious metals to be had. So why waste time here when there were cities of gold and mountains of silver to be had in Mexico and South America?
Spain made several attempts to set up colonies in Florida, but its first long-term successful venture was at St. Augustine, founded in 1565. At present, this city is the oldest continuously occupied settlement of European origin in the U.S. In the Panhandle, Pensacola was actually founded a few years earlier by Tristan de Luna in 1559, but the colony failed only 2 years into its existence. It'd be almost 140 years later until Pensacola would be re-established.
It's a bit difficult to pin down exactly what the high point of Spanish Florida might have been. After all, it all depended on who was drawing the maps and the boundaries. Don't forget, the Spanish had the audacity to divide up the known world with the Portuguese in 1494. In their minds, a majority of the Western Hemisphere was their rightful domain. There was also the fact that any mapping of the interior of the country would have been prone to inaccuracies due to the ruggedness of the wilderness and the technology of the time.
If we were to look at some of the Spanish outposts established in the territory over its existence, we could hazard a few guesses. At its greatest reach, there were the forts the explorer Juan Pardo established in what is now present-day North Carolina, along the Appalachian Mountains, in the latter part of the 16th century. But there are no records of Spanish ascents of these peaks, and these forts only lasted a few years before native tribes destroyed them, and only the remains of the one in Burke County, which has a high point elevation of 4,300 feet, has ever been uncovered. Other candidates could have been in Russell County, Alabama, its highest point of elevation at 634 feet. The Spanish had a fort here, along the Chattahoochee River in the late 17th century. Then there's Telfair County, Georgia, with a high point elevation of 360 feet, where the Spanish were believed to establish the St. Isabel Mission, the most northern one in the Georgia interior.
The reality is, the Spanish never had much interest in elevation or mountains, unless of course you could extract some mineral wealth from them, and then they were very interested. With minimal interest here in Florida, and its authority stretched thin across its global empire, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that the Spanish claim of Florida was always sort of in dispute, particularly along the northern track. And this only was ramped up once the English established their colonies along the Atlantic coast in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Still, Spanish Florida remained a decent chunk of territory, but by the mid-1700s, Spain's hold on this region would start to crack. The first part of Spanish Florida to be whittled away was with the conclusion of the War of Jenkins' Ear. It shifted Georgia's border to the south, to its present location. Things changed again in 1763, with the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, or as it's called in the U.S., the French and Indian War. Spain ceded Florida over to Great Britain, who then promptly split the territory into two more easily managed chunks, East Florida and West Florida, with the dividing line being the Apalachicola River.
One thing Great Britain did do was define West Florida's northern boundary to a latitude of 32.28 degrees, and then run it all the way to the Mississippi River. That would have meant West Florida's high point would be found in modern-day Barber County, Alabama, with an elevation of 690 feet.
20 years later, Spain would be back in possession of Florida at the conclusion of the American Revolution. But the northern border that had been defined by Great Britain was now contested by the newly formed, expansionist-minded United States. In 1795, the Treaty of San Lorenzo moved the border south to 31 degrees latitude. The territory to the north of that line became part of the state of Georgia. Now, Florida had the remainder of its northern border But things weren't quite settled. It still stretched all the way to the Mississippi River. The high point of Spanish Florida would now shift southwest to what is now Pearl County, Mississippi, with a high point elevation of 390 feet.
One of the interesting things of Florida's high point is that its present-day location was actually determined before Florida even entered the Union. Florida was ceded to the United States in 1821 with the signing of the Adams-Onay Treaty. But the high point actually moved to its current location 8 years earlier. So what happened?
In 1813, the United States was at war with Great Britain. But what does that have to do with Spain? In the geopolitics of the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish were currently allied with Great Britain and knee-deep in the Peninsular War. The U.S. recognized this as a golden opportunity to have free and unfettered access to the Mississippi River, so they decided to send the military to seize the city of Mobile and the territory to the west of it. The Spanish did not put up a fight, and newly acquired land was split between Louisiana and the Mississippi Territory. It's at this point, the high point of Spanish Florida, and the future state of Florida moved east to its current location.
While the high point may have been settled, that's not quite the end of the story. Because if the citizens of the Panhandle had had their way, Florida's state high point would have moved one more time. Once again, we need to take a look at a map and ask this question: why doesn't Alabama have more coastline? Well, they almost did. For most of the first century of its existence as a U.S. state, the citizens of West Florida more closely identified with Alabamans than their fellows to the east. A lot of this has to do with physical geography. Frankly, it was easier to go north to Montgomery than it was to go east to Tallahassee.
During the 1800s, there were 11 different attempts to get Alabama to annex the Panhandle. The closest it ever came was in 1869, when Western Florida citizens voted 2-1 to join Alabama. All Alabama would have to do is fork over $1 million, about $20 million in today's money. In a twist, though, this price tag was deemed too rich for the citizens of the Yellowhammer State, and it fell through. I would argue that this was one of the bigger missed opportunities in Alabama's history. The last attempt at annexation was in 1901.
If this had happened, then Florida's high point would have journeyed east one more time to its new northwest corner in Gadsden County, where the unnamed county high point would become the new state high point with an elevation of 320 feet.
Despite all this, it's not like anybody knew that Britton Hill was actually the state high point. It wouldn't be until 1956 when Florida would finally determine the location of its highest point.
Florida's high point, though, does stand out from all the others because it has one thing they don't. It is the lowest state high point of the lot of them. To put this in a bit of perspective on just how low Florida's high point is, consider that 30% of U.S. states have low points with higher elevation than Florida's state high point.
Britton Hill is easy to overlook, and this part of Walton County is easy to pass on by too. It doesn't have the draw of the sun and the sand. That wasn't always the case. At one point, a little over a century ago, this was a full-on boomtown, fueled by logging, and the name of the hill originates from that time period.
Britton Hill is named after William Henry Britton, a lumber mill baron who developed this area. Along with his brother, Thomas Jones Britton, they built the Britton Lumber Company and established a mill here in Lakewood in 1904. Lumber would put this town on the map. But looking around now, it's clear that those halcyon days are far in the past.
Lumber here would travel all over the country. The long-leaf yellow pine ideally suited for the floors of such grand places as the Waldorf Astoria or Grand Central Station in New York. At its height, Lakewood would have over 100 buildings, including a 3-story hotel, a rail depot, post office, store, commissary, and enough housing for several hundred mill workers.
In its heyday, they were cutting over 100,000 feet of timber a day here. But the good times wouldn't last. A Great Depression, a timber glut, and several mill fires meant that Lakewood's economic prosperity would disappear by the 1940s, and the town would slowly fade into obscurity.
The park here would come about in 1984, when the Florida State Legislature approved a matching grant for Walton County to establish a park and monument to mark Florida's highest point. The descendants of the two Britton brothers would donate 17 acres of land for its creation. It is a nice little park, some picnic tables, a restroom, and a few hiking trails if you want a quick stroll through the Florida woods. Bring some binoculars, because one thing this high point is known for is its bird watching. It also has a nice view of the surrounding area. As for the high point, you could easily be led to believe it is a stone monument not too far from the parking lot.
But this monument is not the actual high point. To find that, you have to do a little bit of exploring. Fortunately, there is a very helpful clue to let you know when you're close. Let's go check it out.
To find the high point, head down the Red-Blue Trail. It's a quick walk on a well-trod path. Take it till it splits.
Once you go by the High Pointers bench on the Red Trail, you'll go up a slight but noticeable crest. Once that levels out, you are on the topographic top of Britton Hill. So, somewhere in this immediate vicinity, once you get on the crest of the hill, is the summit of Britton Hill. Unfortunately, there isn't a benchmark, nor do we have the time or tools necessary to determine its precise location. So for us today, this right here is going to do it. And here we are on the summit of Britton Hill. Coming in at 345 feet makes this the 50th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scott Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, click that red subscribe button below, and I'll see you soon.